Welcome everyone to this integration tech session hosted by the MIUG. Today we have Paul Baars from Rubicon to tell us more about VNet integration. My name is Marlijn Koppian from Motion 10, and together with Pascal van der Heijden from Microsoft, we are your host for this session. So Paul, can you maybe introduce yourself?
Yes, a short introduction. I've been in the integration space since 2006. I've been working for Logica, for Motion 10, and currently for Rubicon. I think I started out in the Azure area since 2015, I guess. So there was a lot of, not everything was generally available at the time, but we did a lot of experiments, and now I think it's very mature solution. We're doing a lot of work in the area.
All right, thank you. Thanks. And Paul, could you tell us some more about the VNet integration?
Yeah, well, the presentation for today is about network security for integration. And if we look at this first diagram, this is the final diagram I want to explain. Obviously, I'm going to explain it step by step, but here you'll see the overview. There's a lot of components on the diagram, and in each component you can implement a form of security. And together, I would say that's in-depth security. It's very important to us because in-depth security is part of the security pillar of the well-architected framework. So we're also always striving for a secure solution. Well, the start of this presentation is with the network connection. To be honest, if you would ask me a few years ago, how do we implement a safe connection to the on-premise network, I would start with the discussion on the network connection versus the relay connection. Well, network connection, the first possibility we have is a side-to-side connection. And the second possibility that we have is an express route connection. And without going into full details, the biggest difference is that a side-to-side connection is a encrypted tunnel over the public internet, and an express route connection is a private channel. So just to give it to show it in a picture, we have an express route with a gateway component, both on the on-premise side and in the cloud side. And we have an express route circuit in between. I'm showing these two components because you are charged for both of these components. So that's express route. But then if we go one step back, we come to the relay connections. The first relay connection I want to talk about is on-premises data gateway. And what you see here is the gray part, the gray area. That's the on-premise area. And on-premises, we have an on-premises data gateway. And also in the cloud, we have a gateway resource. And how it works actually works inside out, the relay connection. So it's, well, like you can say, it's firewall friendly, but you can also say you are bypassing the firewall because you have a permanent connection from on-prem to the cloud. That's the first thing. Another thing to note here with the on-premise data gateway is that it starts from the logic app. So in a logic app, you have multiple connectors, and in each connector, you can configure a connection to the on-premises data gateway. And that means basically that you have a very big attack surface, because in every logic app, you have a lot of connections to on-premises. And the final point I'd like to add to this diagram is if you are using the on-premises data gateway, you can't make a connection over API management. And the connection over API management is actually very key to my story on VNet security, VNet integration. So looking at the next slide, we see here I think an overview that a lot of people know. We have three types of logic apps. We have receiver logic apps, we have processor logic apps, and we have sender logic apps. And both the receiver and the sender logic apps, they connect to on-premise and to third-party APIs via API management. That's a scenario I'd like to discuss in this presentation. Now, first, we will look at the sender part. So how do we make a call to an on-premise API from a sender logic app? That's the first question. Looking at the diagram, you will recognize this. This is the top part of the final diagram, so to say. And what you see here is that we have a subscription. This is the integration subscription. Within the integration subscription, we have Azure resources, in this case, regular logic app consumption plan workflows. And we have a network, a virtual network. That's the integration VNet hub. That's how it's labeled. Within the VNet, we have two subnets, and each subnet has a network security group. Now, the first subnet, that's on the right-hand side, has API management. And the second subnet has application gateway. Well, when I started out in Azure, it wasn't possible to host API management in a virtual network. So you always hosted API management in the public cloud. And that's the main difference what you see here. And also when you host API management in a virtual network, you're basically saying that API management can only be accessed from the virtual network itself over its private endpoint. And that's the reason that we also see an application gateway here, because the application gateway is basically a reverse proxy, and it gives a public endpoint to the API management instance. That's the whole idea. Now, one step back. Here we have API management. We have different kinds of integration. What I prefer is VNet integration internal. So then in that case, you can actually not access API management directly from the internet. We can also use VNet integration external, and that means that you can still call API management from the internet. And finally, we have private endpoint. We will not discuss this option right now, but if you have a private endpoint, it means that you can call API management from the virtual network over a secure connection, over a private connection. We will not discuss this here. Well, VNet integration intern, a backside of it is that you can only use this in the premium version. So that means it's quite expensive. So VNet in the standard tier is around 650 euros. I looked it up, and if you are using the premium tier, it's around 2,600 euros. So it's more expensive. That's the backside of it. Now, finally, this is what I already told. So you run API management in internal mode. That means that you can only access it over a private endpoint. If you host it in a private VNet, you have to configure a private DNS server and a custom domain. Now, the third bullet is standard API management. The idea of API management is that you have gateway APIs that expose the backend APIs. And the final point is that you can implement JSON Web Tokens validation on inbound traffic. So that's a way of identity and access management that you can use in API management. A bit off topic, but another way to secure your configuration. Well, like I said, you have within the VNet you have two different subnets. And on the subnet level, you can define a network security group. And what I'm stating here, that you can allow inbound traffic from the VNet only, so not from the public internet. So it's shielded away from the public internet. And you also need outbound traffic to Azure Active Directory because you want to perform JSON Web Token validation. That's API management. And the other one, already mentioned as well, is application gateway. Used as a reverse proxy, gives API management a public endpoint. We can do layer 7 routing. That means a routing at the URL level, at the level of HTTP. We can do SSL termination, and we can implement a web application firewall on application gateway. On the web application firewall, I will come back later. And layer 7 routing, that's an important part that I will discuss in the next slide. Yeah, configuration application gateway, maybe a bit too much detail, but I'm not sure if everyone knows application gateway. Yeah, you basically define a front-end pool with a public IP address. Then you have a backend pool. And in this case, we have 3 backend pools. We have a backend pool for the API management gateway. We have a backend pool for the developer portal, and we have a backend pool for the management portal. For now, we will only focus on the gateway, but just to let you know that you have different backend pools. The final thing that you do is that you create a listener that connects the front-end pool to the backend pool. And yeah, if you connect the front-end and the backend, you can specify routing rules. We will come back to that later as well. Now, and finally, the network security group here is that you allow traffic from the internet inbound, and outbound you will go to API management via application gateway. That's the idea. Another configuration picture from the portal. Here we actually see how we can specify a routing rule, an external listener with a routing rule. That's what I should say. In this case, we have a public listener because we have a public endpoint in application gateway. The connection here is over HTTP, and well, I think it's recommended. It's not a very good picture because it's recommended to have a connection over HTTPS and port 443, but for the rest, it's okay. And then for the backend target, we can specify the backend pool and the backend settings. But the backend settings is actually the protocol and the port. And the backend pool is what I told. That's API management gateway. Now, finally, in the bottom right corner, we see path-based rules. And that's actually the next slide. And when I start in API management, you can say you have public APIs and private APIs. And what you can do, that if an logic app consumption from the internet, from outside, calls a public endpoint, you can route this call from application gateway to API management. And if it makes a call to a private API, you can actually drop the API call. So that way you can not permit external clients to call internal or private APIs. It's also a very nice security feature. Well, there are some advantages. We have one solution in API management, and we can specify their public APIs and private APIs. We have a turnkey way to switch access to API management. Also a very great advantage if you have a security incident. So that's the advantages of this. You can also specify the IP filtering in API management. That's an alternative to path-based routing. And in this case, you can say that you only allow access from a certain IP range. And in the next slide, we will see where we actually host the integration solutions. It's in a different VNet, and we can give the IPs in that VNet access to API management. And that way we don't filter in application gateway, but in API management, which could be an advantage. Take a little drink. Now, in this next picture, it's basically the same. but I added one feature, and that's Logic App Standard. A Logic App Standard is hosted in a virtual network as well. And here you see why I called the first VNet a VNet hub, because we now also have a VNet spoke. And the VNet spoke is actually, and I will show the next one, it's actually an integration resource group per business domain. So we have different resource group per business domain. Per resource group, we have a VNet, and in each VNet, we have a Logic App Standard. Now, Logic App Standard has the possibility to actually integrate into a VNet, and that's not a possibility of Logic App consumption. Also, we see here VNet peering. And that means there's a safe connection between the two virtual networks. And it's not only safe, but the effect of this is that the two different networks, or three networks that we see here, they act as one network. They are unified on the connection level. And obviously, we can create different business domains per business domain, different resource group, different VNet, and a different standard Logic App. So this makes the solution somewhat more secure. But then again, it comes with a price, of course. I think Logic App Standard is around 145 euros a month. So that's more expensive than Logic App consumption. This part. Now, what we also already mentioned is the hub and spoke network. It's a very important concept in networking. So in the hub are shared resources. So in this case, it's application gateway and API management. They are shared resources hosted in a hub, and the hub functionality can be used by multiple spokes. That makes sense because we have different spokes for different integration domains. Peering, I already mentioned that. I don't have to repeat it, but it's a secure connection, and it enables to seamlessly connect to two virtual networks. That's the right expression, I guess. Logic App Standard, again, I show this picture because here you can see that we have a networking section within the settings pane. And here we can specify VNet integration. That means that Logic Apps are inside the virtual network. And because we have VNet peering, we can have a private traffic route to API management. That's the idea of this. Now, one final virtual network I'd like to add is the networking hub. I have a different subscription for this. That's the networking subscription. And the reason for this is that you often see that there is a central department. For example, I've been working for Volker Wessels, and there they have different branches. So you have Volker Wessels Telecom, Vissersmith Hanap. You have a lot of different branches, so to say. But you have a central IT department, and the central IT department wants to have control over all connections to on-premises, but also to third-party applications. And that's why they create a separate subscription under their own control. Within the subscription, we again have a virtual network. And within the virtual network, we have different subnets. In this case, the subnet has a firewall and a network gateway in this case, because we have a network connectivity. That's what I want to talk about this. Yeah. And the final part, what I also need to mention is the route table that I added next to API management. And the route table actually makes sure that when I make a call from API management to an on-premise API, that I define a user-defined route via the firewall. So all traffic to on-premise must go via the firewall. And I saw this, for example, at Volker Wessels. I saw this principle used in a situation where we were calling a third-party application, and then when all traffic is sent through the firewall, you could say that's the proxy server, and the third party can actually whitelist the proxy server or the firewall as an extra security measure. But you can also use this concept when you go on premise. So that's the networking hub and the route table. Now finally, just the last few slides of my presentation. You can also make a call from a third-party application to your Azure Integration Services solution, also via API management. And in that case, we also want to connect via the firewall. And then the question is, why do we need two firewalls? Because we have a firewall in the networking VNet hub, and we have a firewall integrated in application gateway. And the answer to this question is that they actually perform different roles. So the networking VNet hub is really at the parameter of the network. So it really blocks IP traffic at the port level, so at the transport layer. And if you look at the web application firewall, that firewall acts on the application layer. So I will go to the next slide. So it protects, if it acts at the application layer, you can protect against all kinds of OWASP threats, like SQL injection, DDoS attacks, scripting, cross-scripting attacks. So that's really the difference between the two. And finally, how it works, firewall configuration. Source star means that you can make a call from any IP address on the internet. The destination address is the public IP address of the firewall, and the translated address is the private IP address of the application gateway. And that way you always go from the gateway to application gateway to API management. That's that's the entire story. I will go back to the first slide because it has the overview. I don't know if you have any questions.
Yes, of course, Paul. Yes. Thanks for your explanation. I think it was a very in-depth explanation on how it works on a network level, because it's a difficult concept, right? Especially when it comes to integration. I was just wondering, when you tell this story, what do you see at customers from your own experience? So what are they normally using? Are they using Express Route to connect to on-premise data, or are they using ODPG, or are they using both? And in which scenarios do you see those solutions being used?
Well, at Rubicon, I think the main clients that we serve is they're in the public domain, government, they're banking institutions, or they're big corporate clients in the industry. And what they most of the times require is a network connection. And the main differentiator there is, I think, is security. It's more secure. You can add more layers of security, defense in depth, if I would label it. And you also give more control to the networking department, and that's also very important to most clients. So yeah, I would say that's the main thing that we do.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks.
Depends on the client, I think.
Sorry.
Depends on the client.
Depends on the client, and depends on the scenario as well. I think so too. So you explained a little bit about the app gateway in front of the API management.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the API gateway does the certification termination.
Yeah.
But what if you want to do the validation of the certificate in API management? How would you solve that? How would you advise on that to go? So yeah, so because the certification is being cut off basically because it's being terminated, right? So you don't get that information anymore in API management. But what if I want to do something with this certificate? Do you have a solution for that? Is there another way to do that? It's a question I often get.
Well, I would say, yeah, you terminate the certificate, and I think what I've seen before is that you pass certain values from the certificate, you pass them to the backend, and you can validate them at the API management level. So not the entire certificate, but you don't pass the entire certificate, but parts of the certificate. And that's especially the part which tells from which client the call is made.
Oh yeah. Okay.
You obviously want to know that on the API management side.
I agree. Okay.
So I think I would do that.
Okay, good to know. So you mentioned App Gateway in this scenario. Did you have scenarios where you maybe wanted to use front door as an example instead of application gateway, or or do you have like an explicit sample why you chose application gateway instead of front door?
Well, I think in this case I chose application gateway because we need a solution that's inside a virtual network and that it's linked to a specific region. And what I also saw is that people were using API management in external mode. And in that case, you can use front door because it's also outside of the VNet. So you can put front door in front of API management external mode. That's what I saw. And the advantage is that although it's external mode, API management is still within a VNet, and you can still make a peering connection to another virtual network.
Yeah.
So that's the idea. So that's an example that I saw in practice.
Okay, thanks. Yeah,
I think multi-region. I think that's the idea, but it's mostly Dutch clients that I work for.
Yeah. Okay, but it's I think you explained it very well. I understand that. So you can use both, but when it comes from a deployment in an internal VNet, an app gateway is a more appropriate way to go. I think so. I totally agree. Okay. No. Okay, but I think I'm out of questions. Marlijn, do you have some questions or?
No, not anymore. So thank you, Paul, for taking time to give us a better understanding of the VNet integration. And I think this will conclude this integration tech session. And for our viewers, we hope you enjoyed this session, and we will see you in the next.
Yes. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks.